Good morning, good morning. Hi. Welcome into another podcast episode. Welcome to Morning Glory if you're new. If you are new to the podcast, I'm Brad Evans. I use the podcast generally to chat about whatever I feel like, and on a morning, hence the title. We're not actually talking hard willy. Anyway, on top of that, I also tend to use the podcast to speak about music and do deep dives / video essays into albums that I love. Just because I used to do music content on my main channel, I no longer do. So if you're watching this on my second channel, maybe check out my main if you want to, or check out the channel. There's a bunch of things on the channel, so yes. Otherwise, hello, welcome in. We're deep diving into Taylor's Tortured Poets today. I'm very excited. I'm going to try and make this as efficient as possible because the Ariana one took me about 2 hours. And I'm not going to lie, guys. So I purchased a lovely notebook to take down my notes because I'd much rather have them written down rather than like on an iPad or something because it just feels a bit stupid that way. I've made some notes. This is an A4 notebook, and put it this way, I've made about 16 pages of notes. So I'm hoping that we can keep this under 2 hours. Who knows? So let's just crack on in. Two things before we actually get into dissecting track by track that I wanted to mention. I've seen some interesting discourse surrounding this album, and I think the main thing I see a lot, and I mean with Taylor in general, which I'll never really understand, is whenever Taylor releases new music, the people that aren't Taylor Swift fans, like, they kind of make it their mission to make us all hate the album, you know? Like, it's okay to just be like, I don't like it, it's not my thing, I don't like her music's not my thing. That's totally fine. But I feel like this time specifically, like, it's been really crazy with people, like, actively going out of their way to make everybody either feel bad about liking it, putting people down for liking it, and then also trying to convince them why they shouldn't like it. And it's very odd. So that's the first thing that I think, can we just get a grip? Can we let people just like the music that they like, you know? I have seen some Swifties not really care for this album, and with that has come a lot of like negativity towards like how wordy this album is. And I want to just mention this. The album's called The Tortured Poets Department, but you're shocked that it's wordy. And, like, there's a lot of words in the songs. Like, coming into this album, I wasn't expecting her normal or, like, albums that we'd got previous, like these, like, pop bangers, like, a bit more surface-level bangers. I wasn't expecting that whatsoever. So I don't think that was necessarily a shock to me to see how like wordy this album is. And I also will say this, the thing I like about Taylor's work the most, and the reason why I think she's my favorite artist, is because when it comes to music, I enjoy the figuring out what things mean and the dissecting and decoding things. I really like that about music. Like, I can listen to obviously just like more generic pop music, but I think what I like so much about Taylor's is that it really gets you thinking for the most part. And that's why I think I really like this album. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think this album's a grower, okay? I'm more obsessed with it now, having gone through this process of like delving into each track, than when I first listened to it. So I definitely think maybe give it a bit of time. But if you don't like it, that's fair. You're not going to like every single thing she puts out, you know, that's totally fine. And I do almost understand why this one may be a bit polarizing, because it is very wordy, quite academic. Like, it's very, very story-based. Like, it's some of her deepest work yet. So there is that. One last thing, we're going to be only tackling the first 16 tracks today, because otherwise I did worry that we'd be here for maybe 4 or 5 hours. So for now, we're going to do the first 16 tracks. If you guys are interested in me doing a part 2 to this, and I can come back and I can deep dive through the anthology, because I'd really like that, then let me know, either on social media or comment down below if you're watching on YouTube. But yeah, and stick around to the end, and I'm going to do my ranking at the end. For now, let's just crack on in. The first track in the Tortured Poets department is Fortnite featuring Post Malone. The first thing I kind of thought which makes sense because it's the first thing that we hear. The like kind of like the rising sound towards the beginning. In my brain, now I love to interpret sounds in any which way I find possible, okay? And also, I will just say this, all of this is my own opinion. They're all my own theories. I don't expect you guys to agree with everything. If you don't, please let me know in the comments. Let me know what your theories are. I really want to hear from you guys. So I'm not trying to say that I know everything and this is like the be-all and end-all. This is just what I'm taking away from it, okay? But anyway, so the noise at the beginning, that's like a rising noise, it kind of made me think about, do you know, in that teaser that she posted when she was kind of like going, it was like going through the hallway into like the Tortured Poets department, like leaving the Midnight's era, going into the Tortured Poets department. Like I imagine that sound was kind of like, do you know when you go into a building like that, like an office building, and then turn on all the lights? And I feel like, obviously all the sets of lights are kind of separate, like there's a few switches. It just made me think of like turning on all the lights and like them like individually turning on, because there's like a little bit of like a pulsing as well in that first audio. So I really liked that about the first track, I'll say that. The first lyric that really struck me, which is towards the beginning, was I was supposed to be sent away, but they forgot to come and get me. This is obviously a direct reference to You're Losing Me, which was obviously a track that we got towards the end of the Midnight's era. And I'm going to say this, and we're going to hit on this a bit later when we get to other tracks, but my initial theory moving forward is that the psych ward, or like this like hospital that she mentions a few times that she was meant to go, or she did go, or whatever, I believe that she uses that. Now, this is crazy, but like I feel like she uses that as a way of like referencing her time with Matty Healy. Now, I'm going to try and not speculate too much into like her personal life and stuff, but obviously these are just theories. Psych ward / hospital, I'm seeing that as the Matty Healy situationship. And then on the flip side, I believe references to prison and being locked up, very Joe energy, okay? I'm just going to put that out there moving forward because I'll probably hit on that a few times as we go. She obviously then goes on to mention how she was like a functioning alcoholic, and I've seen a lot of discourse around whether we think that this is true or whether we think this is just like building into this story or something. So I'm still unsure whether this is metaphorical or whether she actually was a functioning alcoholic, but what it did make me think about is like, was the alcohol kind of part of the relationship? Because there is also mentions later on in tracks of one of her partners maybe indulging in some not so great vices, whether that be pills, drugs, alcoholism, this kind of thing. So I did think potentially, if I'm reading into this already, this easily could be like a thing within the relationship that they both got into, and she kind of like got into alcohol more because of her partner, you know? Because she then obviously goes on to say that this person's the reason. So that would totally make sense if that is just the fact that like he had vices, she obviously got into a relationship with him, hence her then taking up similar vices, you know? Obviously the whole point of this song is that she was with this person, or they specifically pursued things intimately for 2 weeks. So this obviously does make me think more about the Matty situationship than other things. Now, who knows? It could be about someone completely different who we have no idea about. But that's just what I'm thinking, because it did seem fleeting. And obviously there's an abundance of reasons as why that was. But yes. Now, the whole part about your wife waters flowers, I want to kill her. This whole section of the song is very interesting to me because I took this in like a few ways, but I think I've dropped on the thing that in my brain, makes the most sense. Now, in my brain, I think this section is more looking into the future when we've both moved on from this, or an alternate ending to whatever this could have been. So imagine their situationship, their relationship didn't work out. I see this part as being like, okay, so now we're neighbours. I still see you often. You've moved on. You've now got a wife. She's completely oblivious to anything that happened or whatever. Like, she's kind of unknowing in all this, and she's just watering the plants, whatever, living nice, unaware of the like past that her and this person have had, or the shitty ways that he's treated people in the past. Okay, so that's where I saw that, because then she obviously also goes on to say about how her husband is cheating, and this was like an interesting one for me, because I was like, well, she's not been married, or she's not married currently, so where could this be fitting? So this is why I kind of went more towards like her looking into the future, or a potential future outcome to all these scenarios. Imagine their situationship or whatever, or things never really took off between her and this person that she's talking about, as like only touching them for a fortnight, and then like that was kind of it, like a little short affair maybe, or something. Imagine she stays with, for example, Joe, and obviously we'll get into that more in upcoming tracks. I imagine that part of her being like, my husband is cheating, I want to kill him, is her thinking, oh, well, if I stay with this person, there's no doubt in her mind that in the future he will be cheating on her. You know? So that's where I see it. Like, she sees him moving on. His wife is completely unknowing about all his bullshit in the past, and they're just living vicariously and lovely, and she just kind of has to watch it whilst her personal life is still kind of in shambles. That's kind of where I landed on that part. I also thought, if we're not going to think about the whole future thing, and maybe this being her thinking about a future outcome, the whole part about them being in her backyard, being good neighbors, this kind of thing, obviously that means like you see them often. You can't really leave your house without seeing your neighbors or whatever. Like, I know my parents, they see their neighbor all the time. She's lovely. But yeah, it made me think about maybe she's referencing kind of like the industry, because her and this person may be in the same industry, if we are talking about a certain someone. So like obviously she's kind of forced to still acknowledge him or still see him and this kind of thing. You know, that was just my other alternative for that. I also thought, once again, kind of like referencing this like future outcome maybe that she could be talking about, she's not obviously had the best track record with like people that she's dated and like how they've treated her and whatnot. So that could obviously make sense why she's maybe looking to the future, being a bit pessimistic about a future relationship, whether that be a guy that she's still with from present day into the future, or if this is just like a random boyfriend, or whether this is like a random guy that she may end up marrying in the future. It makes sense that she'd look pessimistically at any future relationships, given some of the bullshit that we get into in the album, you know? The main thing for me that I found absolutely wild in this song is how she obviously says, I love you, it's ruining my life. And at the same time, we're talking about the fact that her and this person have only been physical, or they only pursued this thing for 2 weeks. Like, that is crazy how, like, this situationship or whatever impacted her. And I think that's very clear through this album, okay? And I don't think any of us really expected this either. I think we all kind of saw this going a certain way, and it definitely didn't. So, yeah. The last thing I want to talk about in this track is the whole move to Florida, buy the car you want thing. It made me think about, because obviously she's referenced things before about like getaway cars and tracks like that, and she has a lot of like car references and whatnot. So she says, move to Florida, buy the car you want, but it won't start up until you touch me, / she changes it to touch you, and vice versa. So this kind of made me think, oh, is she saying essentially you can try to move on, you can try to progress, whatever, but we kind of all know that this is kind of fated, or like we're bound to just keep reliving this same thing. Like, you're never actually going to be able to move on without wanting to come back to me, essentially, or something along those lines. So then it also made me think, like, does she believe that her and this person are like soulmates, which also is kind of fucking wild. Okay, so yeah, that's the first track, Fortnite. Love it. Sonically, it's a much more chill one, especially for the first single. I will say, just quickly talking about the music video, I think the music video is fucking incredible. Visuals upon visuals, budget, oh my god, right? Posty sounds gorgeous on the track. He's such a good addition to this one. So I have got nothing bad to say about this track, but I will just say, in terms of singles, I do think she maybe could have chosen a better initial single. I do like this as a single, but I think for the first single from the album, it was an interesting choice. But I like it. I'm not dragging it at all. I actually really like the song, and it's quite ethereal, and a nice ethereal way to start the album. So there's that. Next track, The Tortured Poets Department. Now, this is definitely one that I saw going a certain way, and it didn't, okay? It's a very candid track. The first thing that kind of struck me about this one was, once again, kind of like a car getaway reference where she sings throwing spikes down on the road, kind of alluding to this person maybe getting in their own way, or getting in the way of this relationship maybe moving forward, or ultimately just something stunting this person being able to either progress with somebody else or progress with us, just kind of getting in their own way. I will say this kind of made me think about the whole just keep driving analogy that Harry Styles wrote about in his newest album. I love that song. And it just kind of made me think about the same thing, because he was kind of talking about how they were like essentially in a car, and it was kind of a reference for this relationship being the vehicle, and how like there's like bumps in the road or there's issues with the car, and how that can kind of relate to a relationship and a relationship moving forward and whatnot. I just think these kind of analogies are really fascinating. So that's instantly where my mind went. But then she obviously goes on to say, but I've seen this episode and I still love this show, which, oh my God, what a bar, what a lyric. And I think that is so smart. But that also makes me think, oh, so this person's done this before. Like, this is not a new thing for him to do, to kind of get in his own way or get in the way of certain things. Like, this is not the first time she's experienced this from this person. Overall, like I said, there's a lot of like candid language in this one, especially in the chorus when she's obviously talking about her being not Patti Smith and him not being Dylan Thomas or whatever the names are, who are obviously like really serious, professional, profound poets, which slay. Just kind of saying like, it's really not all that deep. Like, it's not that serious. And I don't know if she's like, maybe she's talking creatively, like this, if this person is a creative and also does the same thing that she does. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Who knows? Maybe this is just him getting in his own way creatively. Because obviously the Tortured Poets Department is obviously kind of surrounding the poet doing their work. Does that make sense? So who knows? This could just be in reference to him trying to progress creatively, maybe work, doing new works, this kind of thing. So it's not always... I'm not always going to be thinking about this in like a relationship sense. She also says, pounding nails in your head. In my opinion, the only time I can imagine that you're getting pounding nails in your head, or the sense of that, would be kind of like the day after something, or like a hangover, or a come down, that kind of thing. So once again, alluding very much to some maybe alcoholism or just an abuse of substances, okay? And once again, that just relates to the first track about her being a functioning alcoholic, and maybe that being just like a part of this relationship, situationship, whatever. Overall, I feel like in this track, she's kind of just saying, well, I know this person. I've seen how he acts, and I've seen what he's done previously, and she knows he's a mess, but she still chooses this cyclone with him. Like, she chooses this mess. Like, she knows that she realistically could do without this person and maybe find someone that maybe is a bit more put together, but because she loves him so much, like, she's happy to go through the bullshit, essentially, is what I'm hearing in this track. The kill yourself line about, like, them both saying to their friends that they'd kill themselves if the other leaves is fucking buck wild. And if we're referencing the same maybe situationship that maybe went on for 2 weeks, a fortnight, that's crazy. Like, I don't imagine I could ever get to the point of loving someone that much that I would kill myself. I mean, maybe if I've been with someone for 10 years and maybe if we're married, but I just think that is kind of fucking crazy, especially if this is like the same fortnight fling, as it were, like this fleeting engagement, you know? And yeah, last thing I'll mention on this one is this whole like decoding you thing. Like, he's kind of a puzzle, he's confusing, you never really know where you stand, but she's the one that decodes him. And this kind of also makes me think about the track that's going to be coming later about the whole like, I can fix him, no I really can, that whole thing. He's something to be worked out, but like, she's the one that can do it. She's the one that can decode him. she's the one that can change him, this whole thing. Okay, so that's the second track, that's the title track. Once again, I don't think it's necessarily where we all thought that track was going to go, but fun nonetheless. Moving on, My Boy Only Breaks His Favourite Toys. Now this one I have wrote a bunch about. This one's fascinating. There's a few on the album that I really went ham on. This is definitely one of them because there's so many references to toys, and I think it's such a perfect analogy for how people can be used in relationships when a relationship is kind of toxic, that whole thing, right? So there was a bunch here. Like, I could have gone further into these tracks. I'm not gonna lie, guys. Like, I've tried to limit myself because I easily could have like analyzed every fucking line if I really wanted to. Okay, there's an abundance of things here to work with. So I've tried to skim the surface as much as possible, but yeah. So My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys. Now, I do think that this maybe could be in reference to either of the two people that the majority of the album is surrounding. Okay, I easily could see it being more about the latter, the short stint, but there is also things in here that make me think, like, who knows? Like, maybe she's talking about both. You know, maybe this is just how she's felt, kind of like in the past maybe couple of years or whatever, or the last year, coming out of one relationship, trying to get into another one, and like things not working out, that whole thing. This might not just be about one person, is my point. So she starts by singing "Oh, Here We Go Again," aka another fucking episode. We've seen this show before. We've seen this episode before. We still love the show, that whole thing. This person called the rain to end our days of wild. Once again, stop their relationship, stopping progression in some sort of way, getting in their own way, that whole thing. Once again, relates to the previous tracks. Sickest army guy. Now, I know a lot of people obviously use the term sick to obviously reference like maybe something going a bit wrong upstairs or ill. But I know in the UK, like, people also use the word sick. I don't know about anywhere else, but I know in the UK, a lot of people use like sick if like a toy is like cool, which kind of would make sense in this way because obviously we are talking about toys. So maybe she's saying like the coolest army doll, like the coolest guy, that whole thing. Or she could just be meaning like sickest, like we've got problems. Okay. Rivulets descend my plastic smile. Now, what a fucking line that is. Rivulets, I did do some Google searching because there was a few words in the album that I wasn't sure on. So I've got the definitions for you guys if you do want to know and you've not taken the time to Google yourself. So here we go. A rivulet is a small stream of water, essentially, right? AKA, she's fucking crying, all right? But naturally, in Taylor Swift form, she makes it much more beautiful and like decadent, you know? Like there was a lyric in another song where she's kind of like, she basically says that she's laying down crying, and it's like something about salt streams into my ears or something she says, which, come on, come through. But then she obviously mentions that like that's kind of what she's like now, like rivulets descend her plastic smile, but you should have seen him when he first got her, kind of saying maybe like he loved her. Like when you realistically, when you get a new toy, there's that excitement there. There's like, you want to play with it all the time, all these kind of things. I've got a new computer arriving today when I'm recording this. I'm excited. Okay, there's that excitement there. And moving forward, I would just like to point out that line there, like, you should have seen him when he first got her, like kind of referencing him maybe idolizing her or just treating her much better when he first got her. We're going to come back to that when we get into The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, okay? So there is that. Moving on, she obviously mentions that she's the queen of sandcastles that he destroys. Now, this obviously made me think about how easy sand and like sandcastles and stuff are to destroy or wash away. And it kind of made me think about, and this is also in reference to other tracks in the album that we'll talk about, but how maybe he finds it very easy to diminish her work or what she's built, this kind of thing. And this is kind of where I thought, this also could be about her more long-term partner, in that he was all not not that I know, but we can assume that, like, because he was quite a private person, and like some things that she's mentioned in certain songs, that maybe he wasn't fond of the life that she lived, or the heights that her career took her to, and the fame and all that kind of thing, because he was more of a private person. So it does just make me think this could be about just how she's been treated recently. Because how interesting, like, she could have easily said, like she's literally, I think she had a song on Speak Now about like castles crumbling or something. Like, but she chose to reference sand castles because they're innately extremely easy to destroy. Like one gust of wind, one kick, one fucking wave, and it's gone. You know? And there's also references to this person being like the ocean, being like the sea, that I will also talk about later, that I think is all very interesting, and this kind of intertwines together, in my opinion. So that would make the most sense, okay? Now, the next part, very fucking fascinating. This whole put me back on the shelf, but first pull the string, and I'll tell you that he runs because he loves me. That part, oh my God, I could have delved into this even deeper than I already have, but let's get into it. Obviously, being put back on the shelf, meaning becoming single again, someone else can pick her up. Like, she's kind of just like existing, and these people come and they choose her and they take her home with them. That whole thing, like, it's kind of like not her choice. Like, these kind of relationships like are kind of happening beyond her control, which is something that she also speaks about, I think, in the next track. The catchphrase, right? The whole "he runs because he loves me" thing. Many ways that this could be interpreted, in my opinion. Obviously, when you have a toy, you pull the string. That's a catchphrase that is like encoded in the toy. That's not something that we have control over. So it made me think that, like, is this her way of saying that, like, she was convincing herself that this is why he leaves, because he loves her? Or is this him saying this to her and then him trying to make her believe it, and like drilling it into her that that's the reason why he runs, and like why he's like hard to pin down, this kind of thing, gets in the way of their relationship moving forward because he loves her, which is very fucked up in my opinion. But that's what it made me think of, like the pull the string thing. Very interesting. Overall, major commitment problems from the guy's side, right, to the relationship-y side. Okay, major commitment problems, which just don't get in relationships. If you've got commitment issues, don't get in a relationship. Just don't do it. You're wasting both of our times. Just don't fucking do it. I don't want it. Anyway, the "once I fixed me" lyric, oh my God, insane. But it also made me think, does this person enjoy breaking down things or breaking girls, this kind of thing? Because she says, "Once I fix me, he's going to want her back," or something, she says. Oh no, "Once I fix me, he's going to miss me." Like, it's like he enjoys or takes, I don't know, it takes pride in like getting something shiny and new and then destroying it and using it. So then when they then build themselves back up, he wants to go again. Does that make sense? And once again, it made me think about this whole toy reference, about how if you obviously use a toy in a not very nice manner, you're gonna break the toy. Whereas like if you take care of a toy, it can literally last your lifetime. You know, like, I know my family have got fucking things in their attic of like toys and stuff that they've like obviously kept from when they were a kid, and it's lasted how many years because you've preserved it and you've took care of it. And I just think the whole toy thing is so fucking cool, in my opinion. And that's kind of what it made me think about, like this whole him abusing the toy, not taking care of it, so innately it's going to break. And then the last thing I kind of wrote down is the whole, like, she felt more for him during, like, the stint, or, like, when they played for keeps, or, like, when everything was kind of fake, than she did with all the other Kens. And in terms of Kens, I imagine she's kind of referencing herself as being, like, Barbie. So it made me think maybe the Kens are maybe previous people that we've been with or whatever. So she essentially is saying that she felt more during this short time with this person, kind of playing pretend because none of it ended up being real, than other people that she's dated in the past. Crazy. Now, next one, Down Bad, definitely one of my favorite tracks. I don't think that's a shock. I think a lot of people are living for Down Bad. So there is that. And I did, in fact, draw, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it. I might have to zoom in or whatever, but I did, in fact, draw a little alien because there's an abundance of alien references in this track that I am going to talk about at length now. The first thing I want to say is the production in this track, I feel like, does kind of emulate the UFO energy. Like, it has kind of like the synthy. What's that instrument? Is it a theremin? Do you know the one where where it's like you put a stick or something to it and it like makes the woo sounds? I think it's a theremin, but I'm not sure. It kind of gives that energy. It kind of gives extraterrestrial UFO, but like chic, I think. Obviously, and it's like mixed in with a bunch of other like production choices, but there is a certain sound design there that I'm like, okay, we're ETs here. We're talking extraterrestrials. Overall, in this track, it's kind of crazy that we're talking about someone being so otherworldly to us in reference to, once again, I think this like short stint situationship thing. Like, this person really just like took over everything, took over her whole existence. He beamed her up just to mess with her, right? He probed her. Played with her emotions, maybe, this whole thing being hard to figure out. Like, he's kind of a fucking puzzle. We've mentioned this before. So this completely makes sense in relation to the last few tracks. Petulant, meaning bad-tempered. Now, I wanted to research what petulant meant because I had my own idea, but I wanted to be sure. So, petulance is obviously like when someone's bad-tempered or kind of like sulking vibes. And there's going to be a few tracks that I feel like encapsulate the very petulant teenager energy that I'll note when we go forward. Waking Up in Blood. Realistically, I was like, what the fuck could she be talking about here? And I think we are just kind of like, we're going more fictional with this one and kind of creating an instance where someone's been beamed up in a fucking UFO, fucked around with, probed, right, messed with, and then they're just left in a pool of blood, fucked over completely in just the field in the middle of nowhere. And I think that's kind of where she was like taking us with like the imagery. I don't necessarily think she woke up in blood at some point, you know? I don't see that being a thing, but who knows? And I wrote after the probing. Okay, so there we go. Overall, she's very fuck it with this song. Like, she's very just like, well, what's the fucking point? The like I lost my twin line is insane. Because like, not only like do you think that this is your person, like it's a deep connection on like another level. Waving at the ship. Now, this kind of also makes me think about the first track with her kind of talking about this whole, they're now good neighbors. She still has to see this person often, whatever. Like, she can't just like, she doesn't get to just leave and never see this person again. Like, he's still around. She has to watch him move on and do his thing. So, like, we're like waving at the ship and, like, we can still see him just, like, passing us by, that whole thing, which is such sad imagery. Now, hostile takeover. I also wanted to make sure I knew exactly what that meant. And online, it says that essentially this means that an entity takes control of something without the knowledge of the other party, or like against the wishes of said party. So once again, kind of talking about the thing that we mentioned in the last track, with these kind of like things happening and these relationships kind of happening out of her control. Like, she's just there, she's just on the shelf. These people pick her up, choose to take her home with them, do what they will with her, and then just kind of leave her for dust. Once again, very similar vibes. That's that one. Out of all the tracks so far, Down Bad is a bit more on the, I don't want to say generic because that sounds really bad, but like a bit more palatable side, I think. And I think that's why a lot of people are gravitating towards that, because that one's not the most deep in terms of lyrics. Like, it's a bit more on the easy side to understand, I think. So it completely makes sense that that's one that's doing really well Okay, next track, So Long London. Oh my fucking God. Guys, this one's another one. I kind of want to lean back, so let me just get comfortable. This one's another one, right? I wrote a bunch about this one and I could have gone even further with it, right? This one, lyrically, is an absolutely insane track, okay? The fact that, obviously, like, rather than using names and being so on the nose with it, she chose to obviously reference this person and used London as him, like he is London in this song, I think is beautiful. Anxious Boots, I wrote. Anxious Boots and Panic. I did mention this in my reaction. If you've watched the reaction, it's on my main channel. If you haven't, I'll mention it here again. I think the production definitely gives panic. Like it induces kind of like a panic or an anxiety feeling, I think, and it's quite a juxtaposition with how obviously she's singing quite ethereal in this number. It kind of does make me think once again about us like maybe running away from a relationship or our problems, that kind of thing. Now, the first part where she kind of talks about she sees fairy lights through the mist. There's a whole talk about a rift. She pulled him tighter every time that he'd drift away. This whole thing, essentially saying that when they're in a rough patch, the rough patch being the mist, right? Not being able to see through the haze or whatever. There's a saying there, I feel like. I'm not sure, there's a saying when like people are like going through a rough patch, like we can't see something through the something. I can't remember what it is, but let me know in the comments if you can remember. Essentially, they're in a rough patch. She could see a nice and pleasant way out of it, aka the fairy lights. And she essentially tried to pull them both through, and he wasn't trying. And it was kind of left up to her to try and pull them both through, which is really fucking sad. The whole thing about, like, my spine split from carrying us up the hill. Now, guys, this made me think about Up. If you've seen Up, you know the part I'm talking about. The hill, the elderly couple, that whole thing. Oh my God, that scene is so emotionally damaging, right? So I don't know why, that's just where my mind went. I even drew a little hill and two people on it. So there is that. Overall, this track is kind of saying that the whole she stopped trying, she couldn't take more, she had to give up. Like he, like I said, wasn't trying, and it was kind of left up to her. And she's kind of saying like, how much of this do you really think I could take before I just like completely once again broke or couldn't take more and simply had to leave? Because she was the one that, like, it was falling on her, the relationship was falling on her shoulders to try and continue or to fix, kind of thing, right? This obviously made me think that this relationship ended up being very one-sided towards the end, maybe leading to her or both of them maybe being mentally checked out, which we see all the time. Like, I have a sister, she was in a relationship for about 6 years, and towards the end, you're kind of just like mentally checked out before you even end the relationship. So I think a lot of people tend to judge people for moving on too fast, and I think this is what also maybe happened with Ariana, and I mentioned this in that deep dive. But it definitely is a thing where you're still in a relationship because it's comfortable, but mentally you're both not there. Like, it's not the same relationship. You both know it's not working. You're mentally just gone, and you've mentally moved on already, but you're yet to take the physical step. Does that make sense? So I think that's where we're at, and that's just kind of an assumption that I've come to with this relationship. Now, once again, this is just my theory. This is just how I see it working out. This part was really insane. I didn't opt in to be your odd one out, essentially saying, like, they didn't fit together anymore. Like, obviously, it started off great, but if someone's an odd one out, like, you don't fit there. This is no longer working. I founded the club she's heard great things about. Ooh. Now, I'm sure this could be taken in many ways, right? And to most, I'm sure this doesn't even sound like a very interesting lyric, right? I think this one's very interesting because I took this as kind of like a way, right? Because once again, there is a lot of talk of like infidelity, people maybe cheating, this kind of thing. So it did make me think, oh, maybe he is like maybe they've both kind of had a wandering eye. Maybe there's a girl that she knows is maybe interested in this person, and not necessarily she cares because she's not interested anymore, that kind of thing. And maybe she's kind of saying she made him who he is. Like, she's only really heard about this person through him being with Taylor, right? That's just the way I took it. I took it in quite a cocky way, and I kind of like that. I founded the club she's heard great things about. Like, if you're a founder of a club, you're the creator, you're the person that makes it what it is, you know? And she's heard great things about him through him either being with Taylor or her improving him throughout the relationship, you know? Fun. And then this also made me think about the whole husband cheating thing back in an earlier track when I mentioned, like, maybe that's just how she sees a future outcome for the relationship. And maybe that was because she knew that maybe he had a wandering eye as much as maybe she might have done, which we'll get into. So she can only imagine that, like, if they continued on this path, he would just be cheating and she'd probably be doing the same. It would end up that way. CPR reference, once again, talking about You're Losing Me. In terms of this relationship, there's been a lot of, like, dying, resuscitating, resurrection references, an abundance. Okay, I don't need to keep harping on about it. Youth for free. I have one thing to say about this whole part, right? Because obviously the youth to a woman, I mean to anybody, your youth is obviously important, but to women specifically, women generally need their youth, and it's like precious because if they want to have children, that obviously, like, there's a kind of like a clock for those things. Like, it's not, you can't have a baby at 70, you know, there's a body clock, as it were. So I have one thing to say to that, and that is freeze those eggs, girls, okay? Freeze those fucking eggs. Because that is honestly one of the most saddest lyrics, that she's, like, pissed off that she gave him this youth for free. Because I can only imagine being with someone for 6 years at such a pivotal part of your life, I think is the word, where you're getting into your 30s, you're wanting to settle down, you're wanting to have kids, you're wanting to be married. Like, she's obviously spoken about that a bunch of times before. I can only imagine that obviously then breaking down can be devastating. Now, I've not been in that situation yet, and I hope never to be, but I can only imagine how awful that is. So that really hurt me. And then the 2 graves, 1 gun thing, it makes me think, obviously, like, the death of the relationship, but it also makes me think she ended it for the both of them. And there's a few other things in other tracks that kind of, like, relate to this idea that, like, she had to give up on the relationship, and she was made to feel like she just abandoned something when realistically, like, they knew that it wasn't working anymore, so she just did what was right for the both of them. Because she then obviously says, abandon the ship, going down with it, white knuckle dying grip. Oh my God. Holding tight to his quiet resentment is crazy. Once again, kind of like talking about him resenting the amount of fame that she has, and because obviously he's a very private person, he resented who she was, so she felt like she couldn't really shine, you know, like she couldn't do everything she wanted to do. She couldn't be out there and seeing people and being seen by the public as much as she maybe wanted to, because she wanted to make him happy, and obviously he had major issues with that. Kind of crazy. This is what I mean. Like, lyrically, this album is absolutely insanity. It's insanity. It's lunacy. Okay. To reference one of my favorite movies. She obviously moves on to say, how low could she go, like with the ship kind of vibe, until she would implode, like self-implode. This made me think about that. Do you know that submarine that happened? Was it last year? Beginning of this year? I'm not sure. I think it was last year, end of last year, with the whole submarine self-implosion thing. People were kind of waiting for it to self-implode, which is kind of fucking wild. Dystopian universe boots. But yeah, essentially, like, the ship was going down. Once again, talking about how, like, she couldn't take more, otherwise she wouldn't make it out of it, right? The altar, guys, we've got to talk about the altar and, like, him sacrificing her to the gods of his bluest days. The pen game. And obviously the whole altar thing, that could be taken obviously two very different ways. Obviously, you sacrifice things and like you put things like you put offerings on an altar, right? When you're maybe like worshipping things or whatever. It makes me think about xoxo. Do you know when they make that like altar thing for all their like family that have passed away, and it's like a way of them crossing back over and all that kind of thing. So you put offerings on an altar to obviously sacrifice, or you'll put a sacrifice on an altar, right, for the gods, whatever, that whole thing. Once again, kind of religiosities. But then on the flip side, you get married at an altar. Oh, marriage at an altar, oh my God. Obviously depression boots with the whole bluest days thing. She's mentioned this many a time. Like she's described this person as blue, and like him dealing with a bunch of like maybe depression or mental issues, which is not like a new thing. Like realistically, we all have our own shit, you know, so it makes complete sense. And especially like being with someone in the public eye, I'm sure that would take a toll on the partner. Obviously, he's also in the public eye somewhat, so yeah, there is that. But it made me think like you sacrificed us to the gods of your bluest days. It kind of made me think that rather than trying to improve himself or get better, he kind of gave into his depression or whatever it may be, and ultimately that was the thing that meant that he lost her, and like their relationship was no longer able to continue because God, it must be so hard. It must be so hard to be with someone who obviously you love, but there comes a time when someone has to do the work for themselves, that you can't make someone want to get better. And if that person's not willing to, then what are you supposed to do? So I can only imagine how devastated it is, how devastating it is. And I also will say the last part about like it was a moment of warm sun, like I missed his bluest days. Like it's just imagery is like on 10, and her just kind of saying like she's not the one for him, but he will find someone, but she's just not that for him. And that's kind of where she had to leave the relationship. Yeah, I just think like that's like, as much as I think we all expected maybe this album to be kind of like her dragging him or whatever, like I feel like we all expected a bit more of like a bitterness on her end. I think this is like a perfect track to kind of say, look, I hold no malice for this person. We just weren't the right fit, and ultimately it wasn't correct. And that's just sometimes what happens. Sometimes relationships just do break down completely organically, and it is what it is. It's sad and it's devastating, but you're not always going to meet the one and it's always going to work out. Like, that's just not reality. But yeah, moving on. But Daddy, I Love Him. Another one of my favorite tracks. Sonically, it's giving freedom. Like, I feel free. This is definitely like a teenage petulance kind of track. Like, I feel like where... do you know what it is? There's certain tracks on this album that I feel are almost melodramatic to a point, in like the best possible way. Like, it feels a little bit like, she's mentioned this before, but like kind of like children in love kind of vibes. And I think that's a slay. But Daddy, I Love Him, very much giving public perception boots. People claiming that they want what's best for you when ultimately it's not. They just kind of like see themselves as morally higher or morally better than you, and like they know what's best. And like it's kind of like an adult thinking they know what's best for a child, and that's why I think it makes sense for this track to feel a bit teenage petulance kind of energy, you know? Like, these people are acting as though they're Taylor's superior in this, when realistically she's a grown woman and she can make her own decisions. Yes, you're a fan of her. Yes, you care about her as an artist, or I guess some people care about her more of like as a person and want to dictate what she does with her life. Couldn't be me, but I know that there is people out there that think that way. But yeah, it is what it is. She sings, obviously, people only raise you to cage you. Now, this obviously relates a little bit to the whole like circus vibe that we'll get into in Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, which, oh my God, y'all aren't ready. But also, it kind of makes me think like people will raise you up to this level, to this height, to this fame, just so then they think that they have ultimately control over how you run your life. And we see this constantly, like, and especially around the time of this whole Matty Healy situationship, That's what it was. People felt that they knew what was best for Taylor, even though these people don't know her. They don't know her. They're not her family. They're not her friends. These are just people that are fans of her. But this is how certain fans think. Like, they think that they have a say over a person's life and how, like, what they choose to do and how they choose to live, which is fucking buck wild. And yeah, she's kind of saying that people will raise you to this height and give you the fame, and they'll support you just so then they'll ultimately have control over you, which is crazy. And like, we've heard it before, like, people say the whole, like, if it wasn't for us, you'd be nothing. Like, I think there was this whole thing with Doja Cat. I think when she was having her whole thing happen, it was kind of the energy of like, oh, well, without us fans, she'd be nothing, which is ultimately true. Like, yes, career-wise, they wouldn't be where they are in their career if it wasn't for the fans. But that doesn't give you any merit to dictate how people run their life and the people that they choose to surround themselves with, right? This is why I've said before that I look at artists for the music and the art. I don't really give a fuck who they date, that whole thing. Sarah's and Hannah's, aka Prissy Bitches, okay? Sarah's and Hannah's, clutching the pearls, right? Sighing what a mess. Prissy hoes. Fuck Sarah's and Hannah's. Although I'm sure there's going to be Sarah's and Hannah's watching. I apologise. I don't mean you. Okay? Basically, this song is a huge fuck you to, I guess, fans, but ultimately the fans that claim that they're fans and want what's best, but ultimately just want control over her, right? I don't think this is a fuck you to all fans. I think it's a fuck you to specific people that kind of ran with this whole situationship and took the piss and all that kind of thing. The whole I'm having his baby, no I'm not thing, obviously it's funny. She's doing a little ha-ha hoo-hoo, right? Obviously. But at the same time, it kind of made me think about how people will take something as simple as someone just being seen with someone, and they will run with it to the furthest extent of like, this person, like, they're going to be together forever. She's going to marry this person. They're going to have babies. Like, that's where they're going to take it. They're going to make everything so fucking serious when realistically, she could have just been on a rebound. You know, as simple as that. It could have just been a rebound. And because obviously she's Taylor Swift, obviously that's going to be public knowledge, but people don't think about that. I feel like people see people getting in a relationship with someone or surrounding themselves by someone in maybe a more romantic thing or like flirtatious thing, and ultimately they're getting married and they're having kids. And that's it now. You know? Crazy. Once again, she kind of talks about how he was quite wild and unpredictable, and she actually liked that about him. Like, she kind of reveled in it because she's grown up, kind of clean cut, which, if we're thinking back to obviously where Taylor started, now I wasn't a fan back in like debut and Speak Now, but obviously through this whole experience I've gotten to know what she's like, or was like, back in those days. Like, she was a bit more reserved, she was a bit more like Christian, religious, girly, didn't ruffle any feathers, just clean cut, girly. And I think she kind of liked the rebelliousness of this person. So that's why she ultimately was like, yeah, fuck it. Like, whatever, let's go along with this. Like, she enjoyed that about him because I'm pretty sure she said something like, growing up as something kind of means not growing up at all. I can't remember what the adjective was that she said. But yeah, so it's kind of those vibes. Ultimately, we are daddy in this whole thing. When she's like, daddy, I love him. We are daddy. Like, she's pleading to us that like she loves this person, just leave them be, allow it, kind of thing. Screeching Tires of True Love, once again a huge reference to Cars. Once again, Screeching Tires of True Love, like, we're trying to ride off into the distance. Okay, she didn't give a fuck what the public thought. She was just in this car. She was ready to fucking go. We can assume that maybe he kind of stopped that and like stunted that, and he was the one that ultimately got in their way. But yeah, at this point in time, she's kind of saying like she didn't give a fuck what people thought. She was in it, right? And once again, I underline teenage petulance around the part where she says, I'd rather burn my whole life down than essentially not be with him. And that's teenage petulance boots the house down, okay? Her name is hers. I love this part of the song. I love this part of the song where she's like, let me tell you about my good name. It's mine to disgrace. Exactly, ho. Fucking tell him again. Right? Vipers dressed in empath's clothing. At this point, guys, it's just a bunch of lyrics that I fucking love. And I think lyrically, once again, this one's just a masterpiece. Sanctimoniously performing soliloquies I'll never see. Now, I wasn't sure what sanctimoniously performing soliloquies was. So essentially, this kind of boils down to someone or an abundance of people, maybe, right? The public, acting morally superior to her and giving their thoughts on something that necessarily doesn't concern them whatsoever, and it doesn't matter, okay? What a way of putting that across. Sanctimoniously performing soliloquies she'll never see. But yeah, because she'll never understand. I'm pretty sure towards the end, and I've wrote it down, yeah, towards the end, she essentially says that time doesn't give perspective, and she doesn't think that now, even though maybe the relationship or the situationship didn't work out, she still doesn't agree with it. Like, she still thinks that she should be able to make her own decisions, which abso-fucking-lutely. And then overall, kind of like the last thing I want to mention about this one is this whole idea of people thinking that if they protest to this extent and if they kick up such a fuss, right, they ultimately think that that's going to change anything, which is bonkers to me. Like, how are you about to say that, realistically, it probably didn't help their relationship in any way, but it also just meant that they maybe had to be a bit more secretive about it, or they had to kind of lay low for a little bit, which is something that we'll get into. Ultimately, just because you disagree, that's not going to make the person just decide that they don't want this person anymore. Like, that's not how things work. That's not going to change fate, which I think is something that she mentioned. And she also said, scandal does funny things to pride, but brings lovers closer. And that's exactly what it is. It almost makes her less proud to obviously display this relationship on a public platform, but ultimately it's not going to change anything. If anything, it's going to bring them closer together. I have been hearing from some people that some people think that it switches to Travis in the last chorus. I don't think so, right? I can totally see how you maybe think that. In my opinion, the end is almost her just kind of like giving into it all and kind of saying, well, you all protested this much and whatever and acted like this moral hierarchy, but ultimately it happened and it was good for a while. That's kind of where I see it. Now, I know a lot of people do think that it obviously switches to Travis. And like I said, I can also see that being true. This is one of those things where it's just like, that's just kind of how I see it. I don't think it necessarily makes sense for her to be talking about one situation and then just having it switch in the last chorus. Who knows? But yeah. Now, the next track, there is a switch up in this track, which I think is notable. So we'll get into that. And that is Fresh Out the Slammer. Once again, I'll talk about what I said at the beginning. I think this is obviously a reference to Jo and that relationship and her feeling bound to it and imprisoned by it. Okay? Kind of gives me Orange is the New Black vibes, and I do not know why, because I think I only watched maybe 3 seasons of that show before I gave it up. But when I was just listening to it and I was writing these notes, I was just thinking about Orange is the New Black. Sue me, I don't know. Running Back Home to You, right? That's kind of like the whole thing of this song. It's kind of like Fresh Out the Slammer, I know who my first call will be to, Running Back Home to You, whatever. This makes me think now, once again, no judgment. This is just my thoughts. I do think that maybe her and this other person, or her and someone else, whatever, whoever, I do think that maybe they had an eye on each other, or they started to pursue things, or they were friends or friendly before the end of the relationship, or before she got out of prison, right? And I think this obviously makes sense with the previous track that I mentioned about people being mentally checked out of a relationship, and that ultimately can mean that it may appear like they're moving on fast, but ultimately they've probably been mentally checked out for maybe 6 months, you know? So it makes total sense for them actually to be ready to move on to the next thing, because mentally they've not been there for a while, you know? So that's that. I do think that there's hints here of her maybe saying that she'd partially moved on before the other relationship ended. Okay. Now, there's a whole part in the song about her saying, like, summer taking cover, her basically just hiding away in summer, but then all the way through winter, it was kind of like quiet resentment, bitterness, sadness. Like, it just wasn't good. And, like, in summer hiding away, it made me think about maybe, like, how private he kind of not forced her, but maybe she had to be to obviously keep him happy and pleased and that whole thing. Like, realistically, in summer, that's when most people are out, they're going to parties, they're being seen more because the weather's nice, you know? And obviously, like, in summer, she's like, summer taking cover, she wasn't even able to go out and enjoy herself when the weather's nicest, you know? Like, she still had to be away from the public eye or whatever, trying to keep him happy, this whole thing. She mentions splintered back again, and it kind of made me think about the So Long London thing and, like, the rift and that whole thing, and, like, her struggling to pull them both through and keep this relationship afloat, essentially. He was with her in dreams. Was this her dreams? Like, was she imagining him moving on and him cheating on her, maybe, or whatever, or that kind of thing? Or maybe was this her trying to make herself feel better about having already mentally checked out of the relationship? So then she's, like, dreaming about maybe him already having moved on to kind of, like, help herself there. Or was this from his perspective, like, she knew that there was maybe something going on here, or she knew that there was someone else interested, you know? There's a bunch of things here. And I kind of wrote down, this is once again something I've mentioned already, about how people stay in a relationship because it's comfy, though they both know that it maybe isn't working, or they both have wandering eyes, or this whole thing. For just 1 hour of sun, guys, she mentions sun again, and it obviously directly correlates with the whole, like, moment of warm sun in So Long London, okay? So this ultimately just makes me think that the whole slammer being the relationship with Joe just makes the most sense. She mentions labor, locks, and ceilings. This is something else we're going to mention in a future track. Once again, kind of reaffirming that she felt suppressed, held back, in the shade of how he was feeling, like his feelings and what he perceived her as, or keeping him happy, was of the utmost importance. Like, she happily kept herself restrained and out of the limelight, or disappeared, or not going out and doing exactly what she wanted to do, because ultimately she was just trying to keep him happy, and she put his feelings above her own happiness, almost. Camera flashes, because what does she say? She says something like, camera flashes something home bashes or something, I think. Get the matches, toss the ashes off the ledge. Was this kind of referencing her now out the slammer and how publicized this new thing with Matty was, and how she she finally felt free? So, like, the ashes resembling, like, the dead relationship, and we're just like, toss them off the ledge, don't need them no more, we're letting go of the past, kind of thing. That's kind of where my mind went. And essentially her friends would try and tell her that, like, this wasn't right and this is not how a relationship should be, and she obviously was just so focused on keeping this person happy that she wouldn't see that for herself. And then there's one last part to this song that once again makes me think that maybe her and this new person maybe started pursuing things before the relationship was over, and that's all these nights you kept me going, so swirled you into all my poems. Now, kept me going, this makes me think that, like, we were, even if it's just talking to or getting close to, even just on, like, a friendly level with this person, to, like, keep her going and keeping her, like, head above water amidst this, like, kind of like the deterioration of this relationship. Like, if it wasn't for this new person, like, she would have just gone down with the ship kind of vibes, you know? And it also made me think that maybe, like, songs that we perceived as being about Joe in like maybe recent times, maybe they were more about Matty than we realize. You know, like it would be interesting to maybe listen back to maybe some songs on Midnights or something, because ultimately I think going back to Midnights now that we know more about the relationship and whatever happened, there definitely is hints in Midnights of her kind of talking about how like things aren't going well, you know? And I will say this, the switch up in production in this track, now I think maybe the switch up in this one, maybe that does correlate with maybe her then talking about Travis. Like her having been through the shit with that long-term relationship, been through the shit with the short-term thing, and then the switch up kind of happens and the outro is in this like different vibe. And maybe that's kind of her from a present day stance of like her now being with Travis, being happier, her starting over again. You know? That's just something that I found quite interesting. But yes, that's my thoughts on Fresh Out the Slammer. I will say that wasn't a favorite of mine when I first listened to it, but I do definitely think that one's also grown quite a bit. Like, it's quite sultry. I kind of like it. It kind of gets my hips moving. Now, moving on to probably one of my favorite tracks on the album, which is not a surprise to any of you because I loved this on first listen. We have Florida, featuring the one and only Florence Welch, Florence and the Machine. Okay? We're letting loose, people. This is the track of letting loose. We're out the slammer, right? We're out the slammer. We're out of prison. We're letting loose. Now, I've been watching a few reactions to the album, and I do think some people are kind of confused with how this one fits in terms of story. And I will say, at face value, I can definitely see that. But I think that maybe Florida and like the freedom that she kind of like relates Florida to being could almost be her referencing the new person. And because she kind of mentions that Florida, it's one hell of a drug, like fuck her up, like she's not really giving a fuck anymore. She's coming off the back of something very serious, very intense, and she's kind of just like, you know what, even if this is bad for me, even if this is not what's correct, let's just fucking go. Let's tear up Florida, you know? Overall, Florida is very I don't give a fuck energy. And I feel like he was that for her. It was, and especially like given the whole public scrutiny that also came with this, and how she also spoke about it in obviously But Daddy I Love Him, about being like, you act like you care, but I know you don't care, and I don't give a fuck what you say, so fuck you. Those kind of things. I just think in general, this is that track for her. I think this is just her encapsulating the feeling of giving into something that ultimately she probably knows is not good for her. Obviously, in Florence's part, she mentions, and your cheating husband disappeared. Once again, going back to Fortnite, the future of maybe her depressing relationship, or where she saw that relationship going if they did continue, that's now over, that's now done. That kind of thing. I think that's really interesting to think about. And then this one's a really interesting part, and I think I might be reaching with this, but I still think it's quite interesting, so I'm going to mention it. There's the whole tell me I'm despicable, say it's unforgivable, at least the dolls are beautiful. Is that a toy reference? You know? Like, yeah, maybe it's fucked up, maybe it's not going to work, but at least we look good. At least, like, it's fun. I don't know. That's just kind of where my mind went. And once again, I do think I might be reaching with that one, but who knows? Last thing for this track I want to talk about, because once again, it was more of like a straight to the point one, I feel. Love left me like this. I don't want to exist. Oh my God, what a devastating lyric. I think that that's kind of her saying that the love that she had for 6 years kind of made her want to let loose, and it kind of left her feeling numb and like unable to kind of process those emotions because so much bullshit happened, and like she was kind of put through the ringer in that past relationship. And I feel like that's why she's like, you know what, love, and the love I had for this person, as deep as it wasn't meant to be, and that love ultimately left me like this. It left me feeling empty and ready just to let loose. But that I don't want to exist. Oh, It kind of makes me think about though, like, do you know when people like kind of drown their sorrows, like after something devastating? Like it kind of gives me that kind of vibe, like self-destruction stuff. So there's that. Next track, Guilty as Sin. I think this might be going back to the idea of her maybe questioning her actions towards the end of the relationship with Joe, and how I mentioned that maybe her and this person started to get friendly before the relationship was over, but ultimately nothing physical happened. So she's like, well, how can I be guilty as sin if physically and like on paper nothing happened, but ultimately she's having thoughts about it, you know? She obviously mentions in this one, I dream of cracking locks, a reference to the Labour locks ceilings thing in Fresh Out the Slammer. Once again, I did say that we are going to get back onto that, and I definitely think that's what it is. Like, she dreams of getting out of this relationship because she suppressed herself, she locked herself away for this person. She's now towards the end of this, she dreams of being able to get out of it. So in the second verse or something, I'm pretty sure she says, building up like waves crashing over my grave, as this like feeling of this person, or her feelings for this person are like growing and becoming overwhelming. That's kind of like what that references. And then I kind of wrote, relates to the beginning of her dreaming about throwing her life to the ocean rocks. She's dreams of like pursuing this person. The feeling of him is obviously like erratic or overwhelming or unpredictable, which is obviously mentioned in prior tracks. So it only makes sense that like the ocean is him. And like, this is why I said at the beginning, when she obviously spoke about her being a queen of sandcastles that he destroys, and how like realistically one fucking wave from the ocean, the castle's destroyed, people. I'm sorry, I'm putting all these puzzle pieces together now. They might be all incorrect, but they're fitting in my brain, all right? So I thought that was quite interesting to envision her kind of just throwing herself off the cliff into the ocean, and she then kind of refers to the feelings that she feels for him as being kind of like the ocean waves, and like it's crashing over her grave. Oh, I just think it's fucking cool. And then, guys, this is another one. This is another one where I kind of went off on a bunch of tangents. Now, the whole part where she sings about rolling the stone away, right? They're going to crucify me anyway, she sings, okay? I was like, I've heard about this whole rolling the stone away thing before. So I did some research, as one does. This is obviously a reference to Jesus. Once again, religion, okay? And essentially, Jesus rolled the stone away in order to show that he overcame death and the sins of his people. So like he rolled the stones away, so then people were able to come into the crypt and see that he was no longer there, i.e. showing that he must have been resurrected, essentially, is what the internet told me. Okay? Her moving on from the death of her relationship, if we're going to talk about the resurrection and like her coming back stronger than ever kind of thing, she's referenced that obviously, I think it's in the Alchemy or something, her like making her comeback. So it would make sense that her death and then her resurrection is her moving on from the death of one relationship, i.e. maybe the Joe relationship, and then she's resurrected, she's rolled the stone away to obviously show people that essentially she's been able to move on. The resurrection is something beautiful and it's something to be marveled, and it's what was best. But ultimately, that doesn't fucking matter how magnificent it is to show people that she's been able to resurrect and move on. People will crucify her anyway. Right? Because ultimately people were sad to see the end of that relationship. And I essentially wrote down, even if she proved that the ending of the relationship was what was right for them, people won't care. And then I just wrote, she was right. Because of obviously, like, I know a bunch of the controversy was more surrounding just Matty as a human being, but I think there was also an element there of people being like, how the fuck can she move on so fast? You know? So I just put, ultimately, yeah, she was right. Speaking once again about the whole idea of resurrection, this is not like the first time that she's spoken about the idea of resurrecting, because I also thought once again about You're Losing Me and the whole phoenix rising from the ashes analogy, and how obviously a phoenix dies the ashes that she threw over the fucking ledge. Goodbye, moving on. And then she's rising again from the ashes. She's resurrecting. She's moving on. I think I kind of snapped. Now, maybe that's all over the place, but I think I snapped. And then the last thing I put, a very interesting lyric to me, and I didn't really have anything to say, but I think in general, talking about all this religious stuff and how she's kind of relating that to obviously Christ and that whole thing, and whether people will believe and they'll crucify her anyway. The lyric, "What if the way you hold me is actually what's holy?" I just think that's a really beautiful lyric, and I don't really know why. I just really like that one. But yeah. Anyway, guys, the next track, Who's Afraid of Little Old Me? I've put a huge star by this one because y'all know this and Florida, they're still up there with my favorite tracks. Okay, so we've got gallows. She talks about the gallows, and I wanted to know what a gallows was because what an interesting term to use. And essentially, guys, the gallows or a gallows is a structure that's created to hang people. So obviously in the past track, she's like, they'll crucify me, like whatever. We've been crucified or we've died. We've been hung, right? But she's leaping from the gallows. She's levitating because, resurrection boots, right? We're something magical now. Overall, this track is very much a retaliation to people trying to ruin her after the whole Matty situation, like people trying to take her down after the fact. So she leaps from the gallows, she levitates down the street, obviously confirming the whole resurrection boots, right? She's been dead, now she's back alive. She's crashing the party, and essentially, like, they tried and they failed. Not to reference Game of Thrones, but I'm going to, right? They tried to take her down, they failed, she's back, and she's like, you know what? Who's afraid of little old me? Well, you fucking should be, because look at me, I'm back from the dead, bitch. On top of that, to piggyback off the idea of like this being like her retaliation to the people that were trying to ruin her, she obviously mentions the scandal was contained, the bullet just grazed. Like there's a bunch of references to obviously like the incident and the scandal, which obviously like we can only assume is the Matty thing, and like it was kind of like a near miss. Once again, it's just how the internet treats people. And then if the person breaks or retaliates, then they either didn't mean it or it was just a joke. I think she says something like, "It's a wonder that I broke. Let's hear one more joke," or something. Like people take the piss and they take it to a certain extent until the person either retaliates. And guys, I'm not going to lie, not to bring myself into this, I've had this happen to me where realistically, like I've bitten back a little bit, which is something that we'll get into. Like I've bitten back at someone that's been a fucking arse, and then it's suddenly, "Oh, I didn't mean it," or "Oh, I didn't mean it in that way," or "It was just a joke, I was just joking," because all people want is a retaliation. They just want a rise out of you. They want to be seen. Because then she says, "Then we can all just laugh until I cry," because it's so funny, isn't it? Right? Her being treated like shit and a relationship that she really wanted to happen. Ultimately, it's all hilarious because who cares? It's just Taylor Swift and she's just a public figure. She doesn't matter. Crazy. The circus. Now, there's a big circus energy in this track, and I feel like overarchingly, the circus aesthetic or like imagery that this song creates is very much the way people use her personal life for their own entertainment. And that kind of goes for any celebrity. I feel like that happens all the time. And then obviously she speaks about, we took out all her teeth so she wasn't able to bite back. Because realistically, if we're talking media training, what do people say to people? "Oh, it'll pass. Don't mention it. Don't talk about it. Let it pass. You're not allowed to bite back, because if you bite back, then you're the bad person." Once again, I've had this. I'm not on Taylor Swift's level, but what's that say? What's that say about the internet? Someone as small as me has the same thing happen. I can only imagine what the fuck she goes through. There's also the talk of like these people not being able to survive an hour in the asylum that she was raised, and I think that's pretty evident that that's talking about the industry and how she has been treated, obviously growing up and conditioned to keep her mouth shut and kind of live your life for the public's pleasure, or like you've got to think about the public perception with everything that you do, right? It's not as simple as just being able to do whatever you want. You've got to think about how people are going to perceive your actions, you know? And then there's a really interesting part. Now, once again, this I think could easily be a reach, but I thought it was something interesting to talk about, in that she says, so all you kids can sneak into my house with all the cobwebs. Maybe that's a reference to the Lover House and the fact that was burnt down on the Eras tour. Now, I've not been to the Eras tour yet, but I obviously watch Ali Sheehan, and she's mentioned before that there is a certain lady, well, a certain version of Taylor that kind of suits the aesthetic of this album that ultimately burnt down the Lover House. The Lover House maybe having a lot to do with Joe, you know? And just to kind of finish off that thought, because I did get sidetracked, essentially saying that she's going to keep her mouth shut and not bite back, so then essentially people can hold on to those songs or those past works or whatever and hold on to that relationship that she had, you know, and just kind of like keep that art alive and whatever. And then she kind of ends the track talking about how people say that she gets drunk on her tears, and how I feel like that kind of means that people say that she loves the drama, like she likes to throw herself a pity party, like she plays the victim. Like we've seen this all the time. Like back with the whole Kanye and Kim thing, like that was a huge thing that people were like, oh, she's playing the victim. Like around the Reputation era, I feel like a lot of that was like, oh, she loves to play the victim, but look how she acts in like her private life and stuff. Like that whole thing. I think that's kind of what that was in reference to. And then the whole sue you if you step on my lawn, aka the Olivia drama, I think, and that whole fucking madness and how far people took that. Wild. Because obviously your lawn, your property, aka her work, the Lover House being her work, the house, you know? And yeah, just in general, I relate to this track a lot. Obviously, I don't understand the level of which I'm assuming it happens with Taylor, but even just having a small little public platform, there is elements of these things that go on, and it is quite a difficult one to manage, but yes. Moving on, I can fix him. No, really, I can. There wasn't much for me to say on this one because I do feel like in general, this was probably one of the more self-explanatory, straight to the point ones. There is the whole thing about her seeing herself as kind of like the dopamine rushing into his system, like she's trying to kind of alter his brain chemistry in order to obviously change him as a human and this whole thing. And obviously, I did research into what dopamine is and what it provides for us, and it ultimately gives us feelings of like pleasure, satisfaction, that whole kind of thing. So she's trying to satisfy his needs as much as possible. So then ultimately, she feels like she's changed him for the better, right? I feel like in general, this whole like his hand was so callous from his pistol, but he traces hearts on her face. Like that is such poignant imagery, how someone can be changed from, say, an outlaw, if we're going to go Wild Wild West vibes. It can be changed from an outlaw that's not afraid to use his gun, you know, like used to shooting people if they disagree or whatever. Like he had like a hard exterior, to him then tracing hearts on her face, something really sweet and kind and loving and like showing a bunch of love, you know? Such a fascinating lyric, and the imagery that creates is insane. And I just think in general, this track kind of says to me that she's been maybe a fixer-upper up until now. So then that's why she was maybe quite confident in her ability to fix him. And her skill set was perfect for him because she's done this before and has had to do this before with other people. But then ultimately, in the end, she obviously realizes that she can't fix him. And the reason why I've kind of pivoted away from the whole, like, maybe that was more of her, like, pandering to the public perception of them saying that she can't change him, is because when I looked at the lyrics, the woe is in capital letters. So I kind of see that as being more of like a whoa, like a kind of like a jolting, whoa, okay, realization kind of thing. So yeah, overall, very sexy track. Once again, gets my hips a moving. So Yeah. Next track, Love of My Life. Oh my God. Guys, this is insane. This is another one. Lyrically, oh my fucking God. Right? Love bombing boots, this one. Absolutely. Major love bombing. Love bombing alert. Red flags alert. Okay, love bombing. She was the love of his life, but he still left, ultimately, is what this boils down to. She mentions, in your suit and tie. We'll be coming back to that one in a future track. Okay? So one of the first lyrics that grasped me was, he blew in like the winds of fate, told me I reformed you. So not only, if we're going to relate this to the previous track, not only was she confident in her abilities to change someone and fix someone, as it were, maybe he was also telling her all this shit. You know, like maybe he was making her believe that he changed and like he wasn't the person that he once was and this whole thing. So ultimately, like, he pulled the fucking wool over her eyes. The part about the Impressionist paintings of heaven and how they turned out to be fakes or like a counterfeit, whatever. Once again, imagery on 10. That is such a beautiful way of putting it. The fact that he metaphorically painted her like an impressionist painting of heaven like this, and I had a look at what impressionism looks like, and it's very ethereal and dreamy, but then it ultimately turned out to be fake because he sold her a lie. Oh God, what a gag. And that kind of correlates really well with the whole the person sold the fool a get love quick scheme. Ultimately, this one just kind of says to us that he sold her something that was just so far from reality. And then the next thing that I found very interesting was that she referred to this person as Mr. Steal Your Girl. And I feel like stealing your girl, realistically, if you just got into a relationship organically, like that wouldn't be stealing your girl. So this also made me think that maybe either they started pursuing things when she was still with Joe, or she broke off her relationship with Joe because she believed that he loved her as much as he'd say he did, or she saw things progressing well with this new person. The best part for me in this song is the whole shit talked me under the table, talking rings and talking cradles. Now, like talking someone under the table is obviously like excessively talking, like overly chatting about something to the point of like, Jesus fucking Christ, like kind of boredom vibes. Realistically, was he just chatting constantly to her about marriage and kids and all that kind of thing, knowing realistically what we know through some of her songs and stuff and what she'd write about? He probably knew that that's probably what she wanted to hear. Once again, kind of confirming this whole love bombing thing that I feel like we've been hitting on a lot. Which, I mean, is not a new thing. Like, people love bomb all the fucking time, you know? So I imagine that's what it was. Like, he knew kind of what she wanted to hear, so he'd just keep regurgitating the same old shit over and over and over. And I just think that 2 lines there is so fucking cool. And then, obviously, she goes on to say, what a valiant roar, what a bland goodbye. So, like, I kind of took that to mean, like, oh, he spoke, like, a big game. Like, he chatted a lot of shit. And then bland goodbye, meaning, oh, he just upped and left, and there was never really like, there was no proper breakup, nothing. Like, he kind of just like left her in the lurch, which is also something that she kind of alludes to in more tracks, which is so fucked up. I'm sorry, absolutely not. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of this one was Field of Dreams engulfed in fire, and I feel like that part specifically relates to Guilty as Sin so much because she speaks earlier in that track about like how the feeling of him and like her thoughts of him are kind of overwhelming her and everything. And she kind of says that her bed sheets are on fire. I think she said, no, she says my bed sheets are ablaze. And how interesting that when she's like thinking about him and the potential of them pursuing something, she's like, my bed sheets are ablaze. And then realistically, would that not have been like the bed sheets and the bed that she shared with Joe? You know? And then it's gone from that to him kind of like the thoughts of him kind of like ending the relationship with Joe to then him burning the Field of Dreams, burning their future also. So he's ended one and ended whatever potential they had. And then obviously like she ends with the whole like her saying that he would tell her that she's the love of his life. And then obviously for her, it's like he was the loss of her life. I also actually really like the fact that she abbreviated that to LOML for the title, because that already kind of alludes to the fact that like things kind of weren't what they were, you know, like it was all a bit, it was a kind of like a facade, like it was not what it was supposed to be or what he'd say it was going to be, you know. So like realistically, she had us all seeing what words we could fit to LOML before hearing the track. So I just think that's quite cool. LOML was extremely, extremely sad, like fucking hell. And then to oppose that completely, we then have I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, which is realistically the biggest bop and the most bubblegummy bop on the album. Which, that being in the middle of LOML and Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, is absolutely psychotic. Okay, and we'll talk about it. So sonically, it's a total outlier on this album, I feel like. No other song sounds like this one. Like, this one is kind of like, it's high energy, it's all over the place. Like, I can actually, like, which is ironic given the lyrical content, but sonically, I can already envision this being played on tour, which is super exciting. And I feel like if we're going to interpret sonically how this is completely different to everything else, I think it's very interesting how, like, amidst this very sad, deep, poetic, dramatic album that's like very melancholy and like just her like kind of spilling her guts in a sense, mostly about her personal life, the one song we kind of get that's like alluding to more of like the like tour and like her having to put on a brave face and that whole thing is just the complete opposite to everything else sonically. And I think that's such a perfect choice. And I just think it shows that like no matter what's going on in your personal life, she has a show to put on, she has a role to play. Like like realistically, I know, yes, she's obviously a celebrity and people like we feel like we kind of know her. Ultimately, like she is a performer. Like she does put on a performance. Like she's not going to pour out every single real emotion on stage. Like the show is what it is. She has to go and do the show, you know? So yeah, I just think sonically that is really fucking cool to have this be completely different to everything else. And also that being in between two of the saddest songs on the album. I think that ultimately just like shows that juxtaposition all the more. Overall though, it is very much like self-explanatory. Like there's not too much to this one. I think it's very clear what it's about. I will say the 1, 2, 3, I have been seeing that some people think that is what singers hear in their in-ears, like to count them in to like start on tour and stuff, which I think is also really cool. And I've also heard that the background noise that we hear, like it's kind of like muffled noise and it's like kind of clutter in like a production sense. People are also saying that that is background noise from the tour, like taken from the tour, which if that is true, that is really fucking cool. And I'd believe that, even if it was like not actually taken from the tour, but it was meant to be that, I'd believe that. And I think that's really cool. There's two last things that I want to say. There's one about the line, I cry a lot, but I'm so productive. That just makes me think about the fact that realistically, and I know this from personal experience too, like when I'm going through shit in my personal life and I don't necessarily want to tackle it all the time, I'll kind of throw myself into my work to distract myself. And I think in general, that is a pretty common coping mechanism. Like when people go through a breakup, that's usually when they're the most productive, you know? So I reckon that's kind of alluding to that, is that like, although everyone's like, God, does she take a break? Does she take a break? The reason why she is so productive and just, like always churning stuff out is because she doesn't want to like stand still, feel the emotions to the full extent. And yeah, like she's keeping herself busy. And then the last thing, which I found also very interesting, she talks about holding her breath and how she can hold her breath because she's been doing it since he left, which I think is very interesting, because when we typically say like, oh, don't hold your breath or whatever, or like that kind of thing, that saying, it's like, if you're holding your breath, you're waiting for someone to come back or something else to happen, or like the other shoe to drop, as it were, that kind of thing. So she's either waiting for something to happen again, or I don't know. She's actively waiting for him to either come back or do something else. You know, like she doesn't think that they're over. And I think this is another thing that was also talked about quite a bit in one of the others. There's one about a grave. It might be the next track, actually. I think it's the next track where she's kind of like still there at the grave, kind of waiting for something to happen, and like it's never quite over kind of vibe. So yeah, I just think that's quite an interesting way to end the track. But anyway, moving on to The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, arguably the most depressing, I think. Maybe Love of My Life or Loss of My Life or whatever you want to call it. Maybe that one could challenge it for the most depressing, but this one's definitely up there. She obviously mentions that he was gazing at her starry-eyed, and in Love of My Life, or LOML, whatever, she also mentions better safe than starry-eyed. So once again, this kind of makes me think that he was there kind of selling this facade, acting as though he was all in and like he was like obsessed with her and this whole thing. And ultimately, like, she was better safe than starry-eyed because it wasn't what it seemed, essentially. That's the way I'm taking it anyway. Obviously, the Jehovah's Witness suit, because then she says, who the fuck was that guy? Now, obviously, there's the very obvious of, like, she saw, like, when he performs, he wears, like, his suits and stuff, so maybe that's kind of, like, the guy that she was expecting, and she's wondering where the fuck that guy's gone that she really liked, like, is now shown her a different side to him, so I think that's pretty obvious. But from someone who has a grandma that is a Jehovah's Witness, I have a little bit of first-hand experience in the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses actively go around. I'm not sure if this is the same everywhere, but in my area it is. Jehovah's Witnesses will go around and promote their religion or try to like recruit people to their religion, you know? And not that really relates to anything, but I think that's quite an interesting one that she called it a Jehovah's Witness suit, when we've spoken about him like trying to get her on side essentially and like trying to make her believe in what he's saying, you know? I just think that there is something there, but I'm not sure. Once again, that easily could be a reach. Now, this next part is probably the most devastating. And when I first listened, this was one part that I was very excited to delve into. And that is, you hung me on your wall, stabbed me with your pushpins, in public showed me off, then sank in stoned oblivion. So the first part of that lyric that really got me was the stabbed me with your pushpins. So it's as if he, like, obviously he put her up there. Like, when you put someone on your wall as a child, that's like a public display that you want people to see. Like, if you love someone and you weren't, I don't know, like, if you didn't want people to know about it, then you wouldn't put them on your wall. Like, when I was a child, had a shrine to Cher Lloyd on my wall, which I know, questionable, but we move. And the fact that, like, he stabbed her with the pushpins, and it's kind of like he held her there for people to see. And then, in my opinion, that just kind of, like, relates back to my boy only breaks his favorite toys, and the way that maybe in the beginning he idolized her and saw her as something to show off. I don't know. He didn't necessarily see her as, like, a human or whatever. She was kind of like an accessory to him, almost, or like a toy, if we will. And then she obviously goes on to mention, once your queen had come, you treated her like an also-ran. And once again, I didn't really know what an also-ran was, but I did some Googling, so I'll fill you in. So essentially, in my mind, that's saying, like, so once he bagged her, once he'd, like, courted her, if we're going to go a bit old maiden, once he'd courted her and he'd bagged her and she'd chosen to leave Joe or whatever, he then necessarily didn't care, because an also-ran is someone who would participate in, say, like a race or something, but they weren't, like, they were essentially like a loser in the race, so they weren't notable in the race. Like, people didn't, like, if you speak to someone after a race, they'll, like, be like, oh, this person won, this person came second, da da da, and then these people also ran. Like, these people also participated. Like, she was just a participant in a race, which is fucked up, my guy. It kind of just says to me that once he'd bagged her, she was nothing special to him. Like, she was just kind of something else there to, like, support his public image and whatnot, you know? Like, she was just a supporter in the race. Ugh. Awful. Overall, this track is very much her just like kind of questioning his motives and why he wanted to get in a relationship with her and what it was about her that he saw that he could utilize and use. And realistically, if we're going to be frank about it, it's probably just like the popularity and the level that she's at. Like a lot, like don't get me wrong, Matty Healy is not a small guy by any means, other than, you know, the smallest man who ever lived. But he's not like a tiny celebrity. Like a lot of people know of the 1975, like he is a big celebrity. But ultimately being with the biggest female pop star of our generation right now, you're going to get a bit more attention, I'd imagine. And then the last thing that I was so hung up on, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but it's the part where she sings, "It wasn't sexy once it was forbidden." Because if we're talking about how I've been mentioning that I feel like there was maybe relations or a friendship or something there before her and Joe ended, that would make whatever this was, and the reason why she was questioning herself in Guilty as Sin, it would make this forbidden, right? So as soon as it was no longer forbidden, there wasn't that risk there of them getting caught or whatever. Like, I'm not saying like cheating, but like, you know, like it's still not good to be pursuing someone else whilst you're still in a relationship with someone, obviously. But it was like as soon as that risk was gone and it was no longer forbidden in that sense, then he kind of lost interest. Or on the flip side, alternatively, once it was no longer forbidden in the public, because she'd mentioned a few times that I think they went to Texas or something to lay low, and there was a few references to Texas in there. Like, I imagine after the scandal and like the main brunt of it happened with the public and people being like disapproving of this whole thing, as soon as that kind of died down, he didn't care anymore. Like, it wasn't controversial anymore. And like they were able to kind of just like live their lives together in more of a private setting. He kind of lost interest, which once again, huge red flag, major red flag. What an awful human being. And then in general, like I feel like this whole track is kind of just saying how she now believes and thinks that this was all kind of an act, which makes total sense in my opinion. And essentially she leaves this track off by saying that she's forgiven him, but she won't forget him. But now she's essentially closing the door on that chapter and is moving on to something else, which overall this whole album feels like that's what she's doing with a lot of things. Like if we're going to quickly talk about the Anthology, there's a lot of stuff in that where I feel like we're talking for the last time about things that have happened in our lives that have really stuck with us and have actually fucked us up more than people would realize. And I know that that's another thing that people had an issue with, that she was like talking about her past and like things that have happened to her before. Like people were just like, get over it. Well, how about you fuck off and you get over your bullshit, babes? I'm sorry, some of this shit, some of the level of public scrutiny that she has been under over the past few years is wild. Don't fucking tell the woman to just get over it. Anyway, moving on, last two tracks. Now, these two are definitely different from the rest of the album. I feel like the last track, The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, was definitely the closer on that chapter, because then she obviously moves on to The Alchemy, which is just hello. It's just like a loving track to fucking Travis. Huge grower on me, this track. This track was not a favourite on my initial listen, but I love this song now. Love it. Oh, it's just so good. It's quite sexy. I just like it. All the references to like football and stuff I think is really cool. And obviously it just drives home exactly who we know it's about, you know? She sings, "What if I told you I'm back? The hospital was a drag." Now this is where I'm going to start talking about the fact that I think she's referencing the whole stint with Matty as the hospital or the psych ward or her being taken away to like craziness, whatever. I don't know. I just think there's something there that there's always mentions of like her getting taken away, whether that be literally or not. In a metaphorical sense, I just think that's got to refer to either the time spent with Matty or the aftermath of that, you know? So essentially this track's saying that she's finally back from the recovery process of whatever the fuck that was. And essentially she's saying when she comes around, bin all those other bitches, Travis, right? She's the queen. The sign on your heart says it's still reserved for her. But then this also does make me think, did they know each other in the past? Like, did they have a little something going on? Because she also mentions that like the child's play back in school it's forgiven under my rule or something. Like, it's as if they had prior relations. I'm not sure if they will have done, but I don't know. It's just quite interesting wording, but maybe this was like in reference to something else. Who knows? And I will say sonically, because obviously she's talking about the alchemy and like chemicals and all this kind of thing. Like, I will say sonically, it sounds a little bit trippy. Like, imagine very like rose-colored glasses by Miley. It gives very a soft core that energy, in my opinion. Like, it has kind of like a loosey-goosey, trippy energy. And then the last thing I want to speak about for this one, like realistically, it was just a love song that I really like. She sings, "These chemicals hit me like white wine," which is interesting considering that she's mentioned before about being a functioning alcoholic at the top of this album in reference to a different relationship. And I kind of depicted that as either being a coping mechanism for something, or it was like a part of a relationship, like she took it up as part of a relationship or whatever. It was something that someone else did that she also participated in. And it's kind of saying very similar to what Ariana did in her album of like, she no longer needs that alchemy and like the chemicals and the dopamine that this other person's giving her now, and like falling in love again has taken place of that, and she no longer needs that to like get by or whatever, you know? And I just think that's really wonderful. So yeah, and then the last song, to be honest, Clara Bow, once again, pretty self-explanatory, I feel like. I'll say this, perfect ending, in my opinion. Amazing ending to this album. And it's essentially just mainly talking about how the industry works in terms of female specifically, and how it's always kind of like moving on to the next best thing. And at 1 minute, you'll be the next best thing, like Taylor obviously has been and kind of still is, I guess. But she's probably getting to the point now where new girlies are coming up, aka maybe Olivia, Sabrina, even fucking Chapel Rowan. I'm not sure how you say her name. Like, she's also having kind of like a resurgence at the minute, like a boom at the minute. So yeah, I think it's quite an interesting one about how there is like a pipeline between the next best thing and then a has-been, you know, like that pipeline is very interesting. And I feel like that's something that females specifically in the industry experience a lot, and almost at more of a rapid rate than men. I feel like there's always a rotation in terms of females in the industry. And I feel like also on top of that, people love to pit females against each other, which is also very interesting. Whereas I feel like that's not really the case for men. But anyway, the main thing that I took away from this one that I found quite interesting is that with every new up and coming thing, they always have something that the prior one didn't, and that's the reason why they're the next best thing in whoever's eyes, you know? Like, she obviously mentions at the end that you like Taylor Swift, you've got edge she never did, and they're loving that. That like, and realistically, that is the case at the minute. I do feel like the up and coming girlies have more edge than not even Taylor didn't have, but like than was expected of or was palatable for females back when Taylor was coming up, you know? I feel like as we progress more and more, we allow people to like, I don't know, just demonstrate different attributes and stuff. And I feel like that's very interesting how, for example, Olivia, let's just take Olivia for example, she has been quite edgy or different to how Taylor was when she first started, because you got to think like Taylor, like she's mentioned on the album, she started off very clean cut, very by the book. And I obviously know this is not every artist, but I imagine in pop that's how it is, you know? So it is quite cool now that girls are able to be a bit more on the edgier side, and it's seen as acceptable still. I think that's really cool. And then, yeah, the last thing I really liked on this track specifically was "The crown is stained, but you're the real queen." And I think that kind of says everything about this track. Like, there's been many queens before you, but you're the real one as of right now. But then, given time, it's just going to keep repeating itself. Like, it's a cyclical cycle, right? And I just think it's really fucking cool. But yeah, guys, that's going to be my deep dive. So now I feel like we should get into my ranking. I've just spent a little bit of time just consolidating it, now having like gone through everything again. Guys, I'm not going to lie, this is bound to change, because from the very beginning when I started this is completely different to how I saw it panning out. I mean, bar a few. There was a few like that I knew instantly that were going to be favorites, and they still kind of are. But let's go through. Let's start at 16. At 16, I have The Tortured Poets Department, the title track. And I think this is the first time ever I've had a title track be not even my least favorite, because I'll say this, I don't think there's a bad song on this album. I know some people will disagree, but for me, there's not a bad track on the album. It's just not an outlier for me. Like, I can remember it and like I know what it sounds like, but it's not that special in the grand scheme. Like, it's not something so different to everything else. Like, I feel like it's relatively similar to Fortnite in like the vibes, you know? Then got The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived at 15, Love of My Life or LOML whatever at 14. Now, those two, lyrically, they're beautiful and so incredible in terms of lyrics, but they're not the kind of song that I'll probably find myself listening to a lot because of how sad they are. Realistically, day to day, I don't find myself listening to ballads all that often, especially like more simplistic ballads too. So, yeah, I will say the build towards the end, or maybe it's on the bridge of The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived, like if it had more of that, like the more intenseness, I could probably see it being a bit higher. But for right now, I don't find myself gravitating to those two all that often. Clara Bow is in at 13, and to be honest, when I first listened to the album, I expected that one to be probably the 16th track, just because I saw it as kind of just like a good track, a good ending, but nothing that special. But since sitting with it, I think like I just like the lyrics and I like the vibes of this one quite a bit, and I like the switch ups in like who she's speaking about. So that's 13. We've then got My Boy Only Breaks His Favorite Toys. This one was like the first one that we kind of got a bit more of a spicier energy, but in the grand scheme, it's not the most interesting in terms of the production style compared to others that we'll get into. But once again, this one lyrically, if we were going off lyrics specifically, like this would be completely different, because lyrically that one's a really interesting one. We've then got So Long London in at I think 11. Now I was unsure where to put this one, because once again this is another one that is lyric heavy, as is most of the album, but I feel like because of what this song represents and kind of like, I don't know, on top of the lyrics, it's a really beautiful ballad, like a really beautiful love letter to London and just how things didn't work out essentially, and that whole thing. I felt it needed to be a little bit higher than I initially put it. So there we go, 11 for So Long London. We've then got at 10, I Can Fix Him, No Really I Can. This one kind of gives me interlude energy for sure. More on the sultry side. I just like, once again, the switch up at the end of her being so ballsy and like so sure of herself all the way through, and then being like, oh, wait, maybe I can't. Love that. Next, in at 9, we've got Fortnite. I like Posty's addition to the track. I think it's a really cool opener. I think it sets us up really well for what the whole album is. And I think the more I listen to this one as well, it's got a very sultry, chill energy, especially about the chorus, which I really like. 8, we've got Fresh Out the Slammer. This was another one that I didn't see myself liking this much, and it's definitely grown on me a lot. Just all the references of like jail, the Wild Wild West kind of vibes, it just works for me. Guilty as Sin is in at number 7. Kind of same deal with this one as well. Like it has that same kind of like Wild Wild Western energy. And like it's quite whispery, that whole thing. I just like it. I just like it more than others. Now we're getting into like really difficult territory where realistically I love all these songs. Like these are the top of the top of the tops for me. So in at 6, I think, But Daddy I Love Him. The drama, right? The melodrama that is this song, the teenage petulance, I just think it's wonderful. I think it's really, really wonderful. Like, I'm pretty sure I said this in my initial reaction, but still, I could definitely see this being on a soundtrack for a movie. And I just think it's beautiful. Like, I could just see a woman running, you know, and like wind blowing and this just booming. So incredible. I would love a music video for this one for sure. Then we've got Down Bad. Would also love a music video for Down Bad. Like, imagine her actually getting, you know, beamed up alien boots, sci-fi boots. I would be interested in that, Taylor. Thank you very much. Down Bad, a bit more of a surface level bop, but I do love all the references to like extraterrestrials and kind of relating him to that. Really cool. In at number 4, The Alchemy. Now, that one's probably had the biggest jump out of all the songs because realistically, I kind of saw that down at the bottom with Clara Bow, to be honest, when I first heard the song. Because initially, I just didn't think it was anything special. But since getting back on it and like listening to this album over and over, this song is everything to me. Sexy, right? I'm writhing around. We've then got top 3. No surprise here, realistically. These 3, I feel like you all could have seen this coming. We've got Who's Afraid of Little Old Me at number 3. We've then got Florida at number 2, and I Can Do It With a Broken Heart at number 1. Any which day, guys, these could have switched. There's no determining factors with these 3 songs, for sure. I love them all. I think they're all so strong, so unique in their own right. Like, Who's Afraid of Little Old Me is a literal movie. Florida is very Florence Welch energy, which I love. And, like, it's completely different to every other track on the album. And I Can Do It With a Broken Heart, same thing there. Like, extremely different to everything else. I just think those 3, for me, are the elite. So... yeah, anyway, I've been filming for 2.5 hours, so I'm going to go now. And hopefully this was interesting. If you made it to this point, wow, you are something else. If you have, let me know down below. Let me know your top 3 ranking down below if you've made it to this point, and just say, hey, Brad, I made it to the end or something. Because I would love to know who's making it to the end of this, because this would have been a long one, okay? But anyway, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Hopefully some of what I said has made sense. Love yous. See you next week with another episode. Goodbye.